Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike McGee. I'm the CEO at Chiefs for Change. I want to thank our good friends at Fordham Institute for co-hosting this event with us. I wanted to welcome Jim Blue from the U.S. Department of Education, who I know has joined us, and many other luminaries in the room. We're really appreciative that all of you were able to take time out of your busy schedules and join us this afternoon. Chiefs for Change is a community of leaders aligned around a clear set of beliefs about what changes we need to make in order to ensure that all students learn. And we're here today to talk about the critical importance of leadership. We have a report out today, and what that report shows is that where we have had sustained reform-minded leadership for a decade or more, we have seen our most dramatic improvements in schools and our most promising outcomes for our kids. And yet, we have not invested in leadership in a way that would allow there to be more than a handful of sustained bright spots. I think we can all agree that when it comes to education leadership, we want stars, not meteors. And we need to make sure that there are more stars in the sky going forward. We also have failed to create the kind of equitable pathways to education leadership that we need to create in order to make sure that education leadership is as diverse as it should be. And the result of not living up to these challenges is that the pipeline of education leadership in America is not nearly as robust or as diverse as it needs to be in order to really meet our challenges. And at Chiefs for Change, we are trying to solve that problem. The Future Chiefs program that we've created is our central effort to at least contribute to solving that challenge for U.S. public schools. We have an action-packed 90 minutes ahead of us, a really extraordinary group of leaders from the education sector, from politics, from the nonprofit world, who are going to talk about education leadership, the importance of leadership from their perspective, and I think it'll be very engaging and valuable to you all. It is, as I said, a pretty action-packed agenda. So we're going to have Governor Markell, former Secretary of Education in New Mexico, Hanna Skandera, Charles Best, the CEO of Donors Choose, David Hardy, the CEO of Lorain Public Schools in Ohio, Josh Parker, who's an instructional coach in DC Public Schools, Mike Petrilli, the CEO of Fordham Institute, who will moderate for us a panel that includes Derrell Bradford from 50CAN, Amanda Fernandez, the founder and CEO of Latinos for Education, Rick Hess from the American Enterprise Institute, and Candice McQueen, a member of Chiefs for Change and the education chief for the state of Tennessee. So I am very, very grateful that this illustrious group of leaders has agreed to join us today. I'm equally grateful that you all are here, and enjoy the show. I want to welcome Governor Markell from to the stage. Oh boy.
Got a whole new meeting to we on now? There we are. Drop the mic without drop the mic. So, well, welcome. We're excited to be here and have this conversation. Governor Markell, welcome to DC. Yes, and it's great to get to hear directly from a bold leader, particularly when it comes to education. I think it seems like if you look historically, we went through a season of a lot of great bold governors in the education space, and sometimes looking around now, it seems like there may be fewer in the education space. Someone's laughing, I appreciate that. Trying to be candid here. But Governor Markell, you are one of those bold leaders when it comes to education. And so we'd love to hear from you today. First and foremost, how much does leadership matter when it comes to education, and what made education, why did you choose to have education as a platform issue?
Well, first of all, if there are fewer bold leaders, it's probably because they see the scars on the back of people like me, and there are a few other folks who are in the room that I do want to point out because they also have scars on their back. Lindsay O'Mara, who's sitting over there, was my education advisor for several years, and she always had a smile, but believe me, she's got the scars on the back. Penny Schwinn, who was with our Department of Education, just the stress that they and Lisa Bishop, who also worked in our Department of Education, I'm very grateful to them. So, I mean, in terms of why, there's no question that these states and the countries that do a better job of education today are going to do a better job of competition tomorrow and positioning their citizens to be prosperous in the future. I mean, this is not that complicated. I mean, you have to do this. But it is hard. It's really hard. And it's really hard because people don't like change. And so, I mean, I think a big part of, being an effective leader is being willing to be honest. We should all be sick and tired of all the happy talk. There's just way too much happy talk. And so, don't accept it and don't participate in it. And that's not to say we shouldn't celebrate the good things that are happening in our schools, in our districts, in our communities. But we have to be really honest. I remember when I was first elected, we did 13 conversations on stronger schools. We went all over the state, and we had 13 of these meetings where I basically told the parents who showed up and some of the kids and others, like, here's actually how we're doing. And here's why it's so important that we have a more honest sense. And the days of like lowering our standards so everybody exceeds them are over, because that doesn't do anybody a favor. And I just think a lot of it is being very honest with people about how the world around us is changing and what those changes mean for the people in our states, and here's what we need to do differently as a result. And it all starts in education. The reason I wanted to come, because I think, if you think about all the meetings that can possibly happen in this town, including, by the way, when Congress is in town, there's no meeting that's more important than this one, because you are folks from around the country who are willing to take on these issues and do what's in the best interest of the kids, and that's unfortunately, too rare.
Couldn't agree with you more. I must say, just remember, when you don't do the happy talk, it's not always popular. So just buckle your seatbelt, as we have a whole bunch of new up and rising leadership stars. You're absolutely right, Governor. On the other hand, be prepared. Be prepared for the conflict that comes when you choose to be a truth teller about where things are. Governor, when you think about your time in Delaware and the success, how important was having time? Mike from Chiefs for Change talked about sustainability. It's not just about a one-hit wonder or a moment in time, but this stuff is hard work. Not only hard, but it does take time. What's your take on sustainability, and how long does it take to see these kinds of results?
So first of all, you prefaced it with saying, talk about your success. I think any school leader that talks about their success is not going to be successful the next day, because success is not like an achievement that we just did. I mean, success is actually getting better every single day. And that's just got to be an attitude that you carry along with you. Again, it doesn't mean you don't celebrate the successes, but you've got to be really, really focused that someplace, somewhere, if you rest on your laurels, some other place, it could be, the next school, it could be the next district, it could be the next state, or it's almost certainly the next country. They're not resting on their laurels, because they understand the necessity of getting better every day. And so don't fall into that trap. In terms of how long does it take, if you're in the mindset that this is about continual improvement, you want to see success tomorrow. It's not going to be all the success, but you're going to see more success the next day. And I think one of the big challenges that you've really got to do is you've got to bring other people along for the ride. You've got to make sure, and I think this is just as true for school chiefs and superintendents and state chiefs and everything like that, as it is for a governor. You've got to make sure that you've got your advocates alongside of you, because believe me, there's going to be pressure on you to like stop the advance and to stop the forward momentum, because it's just not really what people want to do. They say they do, but they really don't, because if it involves some kind of change for them, they would rather go back to how things used to be. And so if you are going to make this, continual progress every day, you've got to have other people who will push with you for that progress to continue. Does everybody understand what I'm saying? Sure. And so it's great to make the progress, but a huge part of your jobs is communication. And so it is absolutely, as I said at the outset, it's communication about, it's being honest about where we are. It's being honest about, here are the steps that we need to take. It's about celebrating that progress. It's about being honest with the challenges along the way, but it's about getting other people with you on this journey who will be your partners to keep the pressure on.
So I hear you saying there is no finish line when it comes
No.
to success.
No.
You have to be relentless.
No.
You've got to bring people with you. You've got to be a great communicator. Is there anything else you would add in that mix when you think about really being in the education space for the long haul and putting kids first?
Yeah, well, and that is, you also have to have a sense of humility. I mean, you have to have a sense of humility and a sense of and confidence all at the same time. And the sense of humility is you don't have all the answers. And as great as the training, and I think you all are incredibly fortunate to be a part of this organization, because I'm really impressed with what Chiefs for Change is doing, and I think the mentorship and the substance and everything and the collaboration that you're going to get out of this is going to be really, really important and very valuable. But you will also learn, if you are humble enough to ask the question and to listen, you will learn from the teacher next door who's not on a track to be a Chiefs for Change person because they just want to teach and they love teaching. You're going to learn something from your students, and you're going to learn something from people in the community. And I will always remember, a few years ago, we had a very challenging time advancing an agenda focused on supporting and helping a few of our the schools, which have really struggled for a while. And I have a lot of respect for the work that our current governor is doing to try to really help those kids. But when we did this at the time, members of the state legislature in Wilmington came to me and they said, you have got to engage members of the Wilmington community who have a perspective and who have a voice, and nobody has ever asked them. And they have something to add. And by the way, they represent the community of school children that you want to work with and that you want to support better than a lot of other people you're going to come up with. And so I thought it was a really good and important idea. But you have to be willing to recognize that there are others who have something to add to the conversation.
Another piece of the paper that Chiefs for Change just put out was about diversity and the importance of diversity in leadership. And I guess I'll take a minute and reflect two deeply impactful moments for me when I moved to New Mexico. Didn't know a soul, and I would say my entire executive team that I inherited was not particularly diverse in a state that had 75% of students or Hispanic or Native American. When I left, and by the way, we should have mentioned that the governor and I have maybe several things in common, but one in particular, which is the chief in New Mexico is a former deputy for Governor Markell, Christopher Raskowski, and
you
former
stole him.
I did, proudly, gladly, boldly. And all that to say, I made it a priority to ensure that we had leaders in the department that served around our state that reflected the students we served. But maybe a more meaningful moment was I had a little sister in the Big Brother Big Sister program, and I had the privilege of taking her to an event with the governor in New Mexico, who is the first Hispanic female governor across the country. And my little sister was Hispanic, and she got to meet the governor. And we walked away and talked about the governor, who was a former district attorney, And the next thing out of my little sister's mouth was, I'm gonna be a lawyer someday. I will never forget that moment because she saw something that made her believe she also could be something as well. For you, Governor Markell, when you think about sustainability, all the qualities you just thought about in regards to leadership, where do you see diversity in this conversation?
Well, and I do want to sort of make a plug for Chiefs for Change, because I think the commitment that you've shown, not just in words, but in action, in terms of the people that you recruit for the Future of Chiefs program is really impressive and really important. And this is not just about being politically correct. And we have 19 school districts in Delaware, and I visited all of them. And I'll never forget, I went into one in particular, the Brandywine School District, which has a very enlightened superintendent, a guy named Markell. And I went a few years ago, it was the beginning of the year, and he asked me to come by as they were having their sort of kickoff with all their principals and assistant principals. And it was a remarkably diverse population of leaders, but it was intentional, and it was thoughtful, and you can't just, you don't turn it on a dime. This is something that he had made a commitment to with his board years earlier, and every single year they made progress because they were so intentional, recruiting, training, supporting, mentoring, promoting, and this is where he ended up. And then, you could go into other districts where it was a very different picture, but I think in a world where I still do believe, and there are those who don't believe this, but I mean, there's no question that it's not just words when we say the diversity of our country is a real strength. It just is. I mean, I think when you look at where we stand compared to so many other countries, this is something that we have got to make work to our advantage, and it's a shame that there's so much going on these days that sort of work in the other direction. But this is our strength, and if this is our strength, we've got to cultivate it. And we've got to cultivate it so that our kids can see it. And frankly, the better job we do cultivating it, the less we have to talk about it with our kids. Because it's not just going to be about words, it's not just going to be about rhetoric, it's going to be about something that they see and that they feel and that they relate to. And so I think it's I think it's really, really important.
I think we've got about 2 minutes left. And with that, we're here to honor and celebrate the future chiefs in the cohort of Chiefs for Change. And if you were going to give advice, if we're reflecting on what matters. I know you said one thing earlier, I just want to punctuate it before you close, and that is humility. When you have courage and boldness, sometimes it's easy to get confused and begin to kind of own the boldness that you're walking in a way that does not actually reflect the reality that we live in, which is we have an incredible opportunity to serve and create partnerships that truly make a difference for kids across our country. The moment we walk in arrogance is the moment the clock is ticking, in my opinion, on our impact. And so I just would share out of my own moments of failure in that, and I hope moments of opportunity to own that, that I couldn't agree with you more, that's got to be the foundation. What else would you say as you think of our future leaders?
Know why you're doing this, and remember it every day. And when there are those who will try to get you off your game, and when there are those who will try to get you onto their agenda may not be about the kids. And know who you are, and be comfortable in your own skin. For politicians, the way I think about it, and I always used to talk about this with my team, is you've got to know what is worth losing an election over. And I don't know exactly how to frame that for those of you in your positions, but you've got to have a set of core values that are so strong and that drive you to what you do that you will stay true to them. And that doesn't mean you're not going to have to bob and weave to changing times, and maybe the approach that you thought was going to work, when you look at the evidence, it doesn't work. That's okay. It doesn't mean you never veer from the very specific tactical path you're on, because you have to. You learn, you get better. But in terms of what is driving you and motivating you, think about them, those kids, every night. And if you do that, you're going to be okay. Okay?
Next we have a series, as I mentioned, of short, exciting talks that you're going to hear. And the first person who I'd like to welcome up is Charles Best, the CEO of Donors Choose.
Thank you so much.
Charles.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me. It is an absolute honor to have the ear of the most forward-thinking education leaders in America, even if just for 5 minutes. I really, really appreciate it. I was a history teacher at a public high school in the Bronx for 5 years, and during my first year of teaching, my colleagues and I would spend a lot of our own money on school supplies, like teachers all over America. And then we would talk in the teacher's lunchroom about books that we wanted our students to read, and a field trip that we wanted to take them on, art supplies that we needed for an art project. And I just figured that there were people out there who would want to help teachers like us if they could see exactly where their money was going. So using pencil and paper, thank you, I drew out a website where public school teachers could create classroom project requests and donors could choose the projects that they wanted to support. I wasn't a techie, so it was just pencil and paper drawings, but I found a programmer who was willing to turn my drawings into a rudimentary website. And then I had to get my colleagues to try out the site and post the first projects. So I asked my mom to make her famous roasted pear dessert that you see right there. Let me tell you, they taste something delicious. And I brought these pears into the teacher's lunchroom. And as my colleagues prepared to pounce, I said, hold up, there's a toll. You eat one of these pears, you got to go to this new website called donorschoose.org and ask for whatever it is you most want for your students. Propose the project that you've always wanted to do with them. Sounded like a pretty good deal. Took 2 minutes for my colleagues to scarf the 11 pears, and then they posted the first 11 project requests on our site, and we were off. That was 18 years ago, years before crowdfunding was even a word, but today, 75% of all the public schools in America have at least one teacher who's created a project request on our site. 3 million people and partners have given over $500 million to classroom project requests, overwhelmingly in low-income communities. The majority of that funding comes from donors who have never met the teacher that they are supporting. And we never give cash to teachers. We purchase the resources and have them delivered to classrooms. And right now, our project fulfillment operation is working in overdrive because last week, a technology company in San Francisco gave $29 million to fully fund all 35,000 classroom project requests on our site. We were so excited, it was awesome. Here are just a few of the districts that disproportionately benefited from that $29 million donation, thanks to the leadership of their superintendents. Talk to Tommy Chang for tips on engaging the news media in celebrating teachers when their projects get funded. Talk to Louis Farabee about his personal support of his teachers' projects on our site. Talk to William Haidt about using social media, and especially Twitter, to rally people around the classroom project requests that your teachers support. Talk to Payman Rohanafard about inspiring teachers to create classroom projects that really do represent their very best ideas for helping students learn. And talk to Sonia Santelises about engaging school board members in the projects that teachers create. These are superintendents who see, like you do, that classroom teachers have unique first-hand insight into what students need and how to get them excited about learning. Chiefs who want to engage people all across America in supporting their teachers' projects. Leaders who use our platform as a showcase for their teachers' creativity and passion. Now tonight, we want to ask every single person in this room to support one teacher's creativity or passion with the DonorsChoose.org gift card that you're each going to walk out of here with, that hopefully you have already. I hope you will spend that Donors Choose gift card on a classroom project that speaks to you and to your priorities, and leave a message for the classroom whose project you choose to support with that gift card, making clear that you see those students as future leaders themselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles. The goal of the Future Chiefs program is to make sure that future chiefs become chiefs. It's kind of as simple as that, and that goal has been very clarifying for us. And David Hardy is one of those future chiefs who has become a chief, which when it happened was very, very exciting for us. David is the CEO of Lorain Public Schools in Ohio, and he is our next speaker. And David, thank you so much for being here.
Good afternoon. So I'll start my story with boarding a plane at 5 a.m. from St. Louis to Cleveland as the newly appointed CEO of Lorain City Schools. Now, mind you, there's about 40 seats on this plane. It's hot. It's 5 a.m. People are adjusting their neck pillows and trying to stuff their overhead, their items in the overhead compartment right before a plane takes off. And it felt like a family because these were faces I've seen before. It even seemed like I got a nod from a couple of folks that I've been running on this plane with for a while. Our plane takes off, and I close my eyes to kind of just plan out the day. Think about where we were going, the meetings I had, the opportunities to meet with kids. And then I hear the feet of our flight attendant running down the aisle of our plane. She slams the doors to the restroom, and we're all looking around like, did that just really happen? She comes out, runs to the front again, and at this point, there are people looking around like, what is going on? I caught eyes with someone across the aisle, and she's starting to get really worried because she was just flying home to see her kids. At the same time, I'm thinking about my wife, 2 little boys, and wonder if I gave them a kiss before I left. She makes one more dash to the phone, and then this time she gets to the phone and she says, we have to tell them something. And so I said, okay. And I'm close to the back, and she's starting to sweat a little bit, so I said, excuse me, ma'am. Of course, I asked the captain an obvious question. Is there something wrong? She says, you know what? There's nothing wrong. We're working on it. Now, in my head, I'm thinking, you ran faster than 8 out of the 10 wide receivers in the upcoming NFL, and you can't tell me that something is wrong? But at the same time, I don't know if I was really prepared for the truth. And that truth can be related to the fact that as we think about education, we have some hard truths we need to face as leaders. One of which is creating a bold leadership preparation gap, the BLPG. Don't look it up, I made it up. Don't worry. But what I'm not making up is the fact that we need bold leaders not only in the air when there's tumultuous flights ahead of us, but also on the ground here in our school systems. And there's 3 things I believe are true to make that happen. 1, there isn't a policy or pilot that's going to fly us out the urgency of this moment. We need more state and local agencies to step up and build pipelines of young people and leaders of color to step in and do great things by kids. We also have to realize that in education, we struggle to innovate, right? Right now, cars are now a subscription service. We now don't exchange money through hands. We actually exchange money through text messages. We have these things in our pocket that are computers that we call phones. But in education, we still sit kids in rows. Like we did when there's steel factories in Lorain, Ohio were up and booming. Now they're rusting. We have to think differently. Second thing is, there aren't any theories that we need to advance leadership in education. I was once told as an assistant principal, someone told me I would be a great assistant principal because I was able to relate to our young people. And I knew how to manage a classroom. 3 years later, I was told, you know what, you don't understand $50 million budgets because you can't even identify how $10,000 was spent on copy paper across 10 districts. And I wasn't even invited to the meeting. But those are the leaders that are sitting in seats that we need to change. We need to give them ideas on how we think about leading differently. Because there are kids every day that wake up looking for a great leader, including those in Lorain. Speaking of which, the last thing I would say about urban education and leaders of color, when we're inviting leaders of color, please, if we could eliminate this one saying, In education, can we build the plane while flying it? The reason why I want us to get rid of that is, I get the notion that actually the complexity of the work is hard. I understand that. At the same time, I'm sitting in Lorain, Ohio, where I have an elected board who wants me to do nothing. I have a community that wants me to do everything. I have 6,700 scholars that come to school every single day, and 1.1% of them graduate ready for college. So I get the complexity of building a plane while you're flying. However, you wouldn't hear that anywhere else, right? You wouldn't hear a doctor in the operating room saying, you know what, I'm gonna work on this hip replacement over here, and we'll sew up your heart at the same time. Or, a business person saying, you know what, stockholders, we're going to take some time and look at those profit margins while we're finishing up This Is Us. Like, that's just not going to happen, right? But in education, it has become commonplace. So I ask, as we think about leadership and leadership in our spaces where we need more leaders of color, is that we think about not only the leaders that are born, but the leaders that are made, and how we go about making more of them. So instead of building a plane while we're flying it, let's build them on the ground, so that we can fly with the urgency we need rather than creating it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Well, all of us who have spent any time in schools know that instructional coaches are game changers for kids and can really be the lifeblood of an excellent school. And when you see results improving dramatically, it's because someone's working with teachers to improve instruction and show them how to make the best use of instructional materials, classroom strategies. It's one of the most important roles in any school, in any system. Josh Parker is one of those instructional coaches at your school system, DC Public Schools, and very excited to have him talk to us today. Thank you, Josh.
It's an exciting day. I kind of want to know how the story ended, so I'll ask you later.
I'm here. You know how to do it.
Right, well, you're here. That's true. This is certainly, it ended well. This is certainly, for me personally, a day of excitement. I was very excited and am very excited to be here and to speak in front of you all. Us classroom teachers don't really get the spotlight that I think that we need when talking about some of these changes with leaders, so I'm really honored to be here. It's also a day of reflection as I reflect on a man who was assassinated 50 years ago today, who remains a mentor to me because many people know him as a pastor and civil rights leader, but he was a teacher. And so as a black male teacher, I honor him today before I begin my talk. When you learn how to read, you start with sounds, letters, words, and then sentences. This process, when done right, is modeled first by parents, and then by peers and teachers. At the end of this process, you gain the capacity to read, which opens up worlds of experience and knowledge that last a lifetime. The same is true for learning how to lead. It is a process that is best done with role models. I've been a black male in the education system for over 25 years as a student and as a teacher. And for the better part of those 25 years, I've had to learn how to read and how to lead almost entirely by myself. I certainly had teachers who gave me strong foundations in language arts and leaders who offered words of wisdom, but when it came down to the grit and grind of leadership, the lesson plans were missing. I had to learn the nuances of reading and leading mostly through discovery, the lessons. My first lesson was when I left my sports producer job to begin teaching secondary language arts. After having peaks and valleys for over a year, I was nearly fired at the beginning of my second year. I had a mentor named Eleanor Hall who sat with me day by day and helped me to plan. She saved my job. But when her mentorship was needed for other new teachers, I again had to learn on my own the finer parts of instruction. I learned my next lesson when I became a language arts and reading and foreign language department chair at a high needs middle school in Baltimore County. While I had a great principal and unforgettable colleagues, again, I did not have another black male leader that could help me navigate the pressures of this position. Somehow, I still managed to lead my team to record-breaking success on our state exams. I did the best I could, but I did it without a mentor. This is not without effort. I have emailed, texted, written letters to black male leaders that I respect. Yet and still, I'm learning how to lead nearly alone. Maybe they're alone too. My situation did improve slightly when I was named the 2012 Maryland Teacher of the Year. There were many leaders present at that time. Some gave me advice, others gave me congratulations, but no one gave me relationship. I'm in the midst of learning a lesson right now. As an instructional coach in DCPS, I have endured the challenge of managing the apathy and enthusiasm of new teachers while doing my best to help them improve their practice. Additionally, I have had the privilege of finally having an outstanding black male principal mentor. This is after 10 years. Little did I know that the lesson that I would learn would not be that mentorship works. I knew that, but that it was also fleeting. The night before I was scheduled to deliver a week-long professional development session, my principal called me to let me know that he had to step away from his role. I've had little to no contact since. To be clear, learning how to lead can be an independent process for many people in the education system. Leaders are constantly taking time away or just simply being moved to other schools. However, when you are part of a demographic that makes up less than 2% of teachers nationwide, learning alone can be a dead-end proposition. We, black male teachers, need help. So now in year 13 of my educational journey, I am again learning how to lead alone. I am not sure where my next steps will lead, but I do know 3 things that need to happen so that more of us have a better chance to remain and advance in difference-making roles. First, we need experienced mentors who look like us and see like us. Second, we need systems that intentionally nurture and develop us. Lastly, we need places to share stories of the challenges we face trying to learn how to lead in a system that is still learning how to teach us well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josh. Very often I call Mike Petrilli on the phone and I usually say, we're thinking of doing this thing, but we need a partner, and would you do it with us? And he always says, sure, we'll do that. And I'm always very grateful. Mike is going to moderate the panel that we have coming up. I want to welcome him up to the stage, and he'll be introducing our panelists.
Thank you, Mike. Come on up. Panelists, come on up. All right, good afternoon. Thank you, Mike. It is always a pleasure to work with you and your team. Although the way you put that makes me think I'm just like too much of a pushover. I should think about that. Rick's smiling. Is that true? I'm a pushover. That's my reputation. While our panel gets situated, let me just say a couple of things. First of all, I love the energy in this room. It was so fun to come in before the event, and there was all the buzz and the networking. And Alice, you know, those of us that are like been around DC a long time, this is not typical. Okay, usually in DC, we're like worn down and cynical, and you know, here we come with the same talking points we've heard everybody say for the last 12 years. And anyway, it is very nice to have a new sense of energy in the room. So thanks for bringing that with you, especially all the great educators here. So we're going to keep this conversation going, and we're going to dig in to some of these points that have already been made and introduce some new ones about the topic of leadership, and especially the topic of leadership at the state and district level. And we've got a fantastic panel to do that today. So let me briefly introduce them, and then we'll get right into it. So first we have Amanda Fernandez, who is the founder and CEO of Latinos for Education. Welcome, Amanda. Amanda, this is a pretty new group, and I think it would be helpful if you could just share very quickly tell us about the organization.
Sure. So we are a new organization, fairly new to the education sector. Latinos for Education was founded to develop, place, and connect what we say is essential Latino leadership in the education sector. We already heard our speakers talk about this idea of existence proof, and we're here to create more existence proof of Latino leaders in the sector.
Okay, great, thank you. Next up, we have Rick Hess, the resident scholar and director of education policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute. This is not a new organization. This is like an old, worn. No, just kidding. But those of you, and those of you that don't come to these events all the time know that Rick is taking this very seriously because he is not showing us his knees right now. He wore pants. Thank you, Rick. Rick has written about leadership for a long time, and frankly has focused on this topic when many of us have ignored it. He's had a couple of great books about it: Cage Busting Leaders, Cage Busting Teachers, and his most recent book, based on his own personal life at home, Cage Busting Preschoolers. Just kidding, I have been working on that one. Okay, so Rick, great to have you here. As you may tell, Rick and I are friends and like to tease each other. Next up, we have Candice McQueen, the Commissioner of Education in the great state of Tennessee. Hello, Candice. Great to see you again. Yes, and we're going to get to hear her experience. So it's so fantastic having some of the best state chiefs here. We heard from Hanna. We have Candice. Chris Surf is in the house. Where's Chris? There he is in the back. So excited about this. And then finally, last but not least, Derrell Bradford, Executive Vice President of 50CAN. What kind of socks are you sporting today, Derrell? Usually, yeah, pretty good. Not too, all right. Not bad. Pretty good.
I don't want to let you down.
All right, yeah, always. It's always competition. All right, well, so let's get right into it. We talked about some of the things we're going to discuss, but I'm going to throw some curveballs at you as well, based on what we've heard. A lot of talk from the governor, from the chiefs, from the educators about bold leadership, about saying hard truths. I want to get below that, though. I mean, that's inspiring, but let's get specific. When we are talking about leadership, and especially the kind of leadership that's going to get real results for kids, what does that mean to you? What does that look like? Can we start there? Rick, you want to go first?
One of the Candice go first.
I love that. Ladies first.
All right.
All right. Rick, you're next. I've thought a lot about that question as we have talked a bit in our department over the last couple of years around how do we really create policy and specific work for principal leadership. And I can talk in a minute about some of the work we're doing in that area and really elevating that across the state. But I would start with bold, courageous leadership has to foundationally begin with competent leadership. And I don't mean to bring us down a notch, but I get confused sometimes when I see people that are really out there in front and they talk a lot and they sound very courageous. And then behind the scenes, things are somewhat falling apart. They really don't know how to set goals. There's not a strategic plan. They haven't brought people together. And that might last 1.5 years to 2 years, but it eventually falls apart. So first, I would say we have to have competent leadership. You actually have to know how to lead. How do you bring people together around a vision? How do you set goals and actually manage towards those goals? How do you hire people to help you meet those goals and help them actually own the vision themselves? How do you bring people together to make sure you're doing the right things and listen to them to make changes? So I think it starts with just competent leadership, and then the bold and the courageous actually comes along with that. If you have competence, I think you're much better at actually creating a bold vision. So there was a question, I think, about which comes first, the chicken or the egg, and I don't want to go too far here, but what comes first, the chicken or the egg? I do think you have to have a why. The governor said that earlier. You have to have a passion, but you have to be competent enough to get to that. And then the boldness and the courage comes along with that. And I'm not sure it was bold courage and you just have the why and you don't have the competence. I think you can learn it. But having the competence first and foremost makes a big difference.
Okay, interesting. I'm going to follow up on some of that in a bit. Rick, yeah.
Sure. Let me just try to build on what Candice said. So I think 3 specific things. One is I think we need to distinguish between branding and actions. I mean, I've been doing this stuff for 30 years now, give or take, and I've met or heard about 6 trillion bold leaders. There was not a dearth of bold leaders in the 90s, for those of you who were newer to this stuff. And one of the problems is so much of this stuff is PR and spin and happy talk and BS that we wind up creating this giant wind machine in which we celebrate people because they give a good speech or they tell a good story or we're friends with them, whether or not they're actually good at this. You know, when I used to talk about cage-busting leadership, people would ask, well, who are the leaders you have in mind? And I would say, that's not how I think about it. You know, in Catholicism, they like to talk about sins rather than the sinner, right? I'm interested in leadership actions rather than great leaders. What are the things that great leaders? Second thing, which is part of that, is what are the things, what are the actions that these leaders do? Well, they tend to be concrete. They tend to be specific. One of the problems is that leaders have relatively, you know, a new superintendent in a district with even 40,000 kids, much less 400,000, is not going to have a big impact in reading and math scores in the first 2 or 3 or 5 years. But when we keep score that way, we create a whole lot of pathologies, like we've recently seen in Washington, D.C., where there's huge incentives to juke the stats, to play games, to move the numbers, whether or not that reflects on doing the right thing for kids. So part of this is how do we keep score in ways that reflect what's really happening in real classrooms and real kids' lives, and we've not been very good at that. Third thing.
And Rick, and please stop sugarcoating it, whatever you do again, because you know, I feel like you're always so warm and fuzzy, and anyways.
This is why it's not at work. And then just, so I think the third thing then is actually falls on those of us who don't actually have to do the work, those of us who get to write about it and talk about it, is the easiest thing in the world is to take a foundation's money to go write puff pieces celebrating whatever the flavor of the month is. Denver, or Indianapolis, or 5 years ago it was Washington, or 10 years ago before they all went to jail it was Atlanta. And it's the easiest thing. Remember, 3 years before the Atlanta leadership, you know, was indicted, you know, Beverly Hall was named Superintendent of the Year, and the AERA gave her an award for data-driven research practices. So, and those of us in the academy and in the advocacy roles are riding along shotgun, shouting whatever the flavor of the month is, and then we pivot without a look back. And I think it is unreasonable for us to expect leaders to be disciplined and to focus on what matters when we are creating a giant wind machine that pulls them away from the things that matter most for kids.
Wow, okay. Amanda, Derrell, anything that could make us feel a little better after that? No, just kidding. No, important pieces, and we're going to come back to all of this. But how do you think about leadership?
Unfortunately, I don't think I'm bringing as much good news either. I'm not going to bring the happy talk, as the governor mentioned, either. I think it's interesting, this question about leadership, because I would put the question out to everyone when you are thinking about a leader in education. What do you envision? What are you seeing? Are you seeing a black man? Are you seeing a Latina? Probably not. And so I think about the question of leadership in a context of whiteness. And that's how we're defining it right now, I'm gonna guess. That's what's happening in a lot of folks' minds at the moment with this question. And so leadership shows up in different ways when you think about the different contexts of our diverse leaders. A Latino leader and the competencies of a Latino leader may look very different than what we might be thinking about are the competencies that must be in place for someone to be an effective leader in our education system. So I think we need to change a bit of the notion and push on the definition of leadership and what are the competencies and what do we think of when we think of a leader in education.
Great. Thanks, Derrell.
You know, there's like 8 questions in there.
Yeah.
So the first thing I would just say is like maybe we're missing part of it. It is also possible that lots of districts are actually unleadable. You know, which is like the question, like people keep running to be the governor of New Jersey. I'm like, I don't know why the state's ungovernable. The state is ungovernable. I'm being serious. Like the political incentives are, you know, don't act like you don't know. The political incentives are a mess, right? The unions are deeply entrenched. The balance sheet is a nightmare. Like you would take this job if you wanted to fail at doing it because you can't do it. you know? So I do think it's worth revisiting whether or not the actual like mechanisms that have to be pulled to make certain kinds of districts go, and I think we're talking about certain kinds of districts with a bunch of low-income kids in them, are actually organized in a way that anybody can get the kind of change that we're talking about. So I just want to toss it a bit. The other thing I would say, which I think I've sort of heard a little bit about this, and we can, I won't throw water on Rick's untempered optimism about progress, but I'm kind of coming around to his way of thinking of progress. It's just like, I can remember this conversation he's had with my boss back in the day in the Pleistocene, when we talked about Cory Booker, who was the mayor of Newark at the time, right? He was a brilliant guy and who also has the best job in the universe right now, being a U.S. Senator. And he'd say, like, my boss was an engineer, and he's a white engineer. So, and he'd say to me sometimes, well, you know, these are all the things Booker can't do, and Booker's never run anything. And I'd just be like, but dog, like, you never really gave him a chance to, right? And everything you've asked him to do, right, he's been excellent at. So, like, part of, I think, the challenge, too, and this may build a little bit on what you're saying, is that, like, a lot of times if you're a leader of color, you lead an organization, or any kind of leader, the people around you put you in like a sort of heuristic where you're supposed to behave in a certain way and you get excellent at those things, and then other people are like, yeah, but you can't do this other stuff, right? And so I would just counsel to everyone that, like, you may have a little horn coming out of your head because you're a unicorn, but like most people who are in positions of leadership do not possess 100% competency, right? Or of the competencies. Like, leadership is like a color wheel that requires other people to help support the person who is actually in charge. So I just think we need a broader sense of what it takes to actually support a person who's on top, leader of color, you know, maybe most importantly given the context of the discussion, but leader, period, given the stakes for all the kids and the people involved.
All right, no, that's great. So let's talk about that then. So how do you build that competency? We've had a debate forever in education that says, well, one way you build that competency as an education leader is you need to be an educator. You know, and if you have had the experience of being a teacher and a principal and you work your way up through the system, then you understand how it works, and then you can lead it and you can lead change. There was a while where we went through a period where we said, no, what we need are people, we need outsiders who can come in with a fresh perspective and break things and not be bound by, thinking in the way of how things have been done in the past. How should we think about this now? How do we build the competencies? And do we need insiders? Do we need outsiders? Does that matter? Is that a dumb way to think about it?
Isn't the answer yes?
But I'm trying to moderate a session out here.
And I'm trying to tell you the question's wrong.
All right, I'll come in.
This is the shortest answer, period. Like, we need the best people no matter where they come from. Yeah. I don't understand why we can have conversations about alt-cert and, like, being able to translate, you know, the guy who's the engineer at Intel who knows math, is amazing. Why we can't talk, when we are totally engaged in talking about changing teacher cert policy to get that person in the classroom, I don't know why we can't have a more fluid discussion around everybody who can possibly lead well having a chance to actually lead well.
Okay. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that idea is not as in favor as it used to be.
Like most of my ideas.
Candice?
Yeah, Mike, I'll try to actually answer your question, so it's a good question.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I think it's an important one that all of these types of backgrounds should have the ability, right, to lead. I don't think it's a one profile. I think we've learned that in probably every experience we had at the State Department. We brought in people from all different backgrounds, all different experience levels. And quite frankly, sometimes they do well and sometimes they don't. You have really high expectations and you think this is the person, and then they come in and they don't. You try to coach them. Sometimes coaching works and they lead, sometimes they don't. And so the reality is that one profile doesn't exist. What does exist, though, is what I quite frankly look for is this person someone who has shown they can set goals and meet them. Right? They're outcomes driven. That seems so common sense, but that's what it takes to be a leader in any of these roles. And I love the conversation around, well, can you just not lead in certain places? To reflect on that a minute. But the comment of Well, can you set goals and meet them in that place is an interesting question, because the place and the situation absolutely matters, right, if you're going to jump into it. I think a competency around discipline. Are you disciplined enough to stay with something long enough to see whether you actually can have that outcome? Or are you a person who's just going to be wave around based on what the it is, as opposed to really staying focused on the why? Why am I here? What am I doing? And trying to get to that outcome every single day and disciplining yourself to get there. And then I would say the third is really critical, and you commented on it, is how are you bringing people together around that? Not only internal to the organization, but external. The governor mentioned that before. How do you bring people to say, you've got to help me push on this, I cannot do this alone? I can think of multiple situations where in the moment when you feel alone, you will leave. Right? Because some of these jobs are just too hard. The chief's roles are all too hard, right? District level, school level, state level. If you don't have people coming with you, then you're not going to ever actually have the impact long term. And so if you can focus on those in terms of competency, I actually think you can hit your stride and find the long game that we all want.
Okay. Let me make just 2 points. One, I've always believed that we should have a mix of career educators and people who come from outside of education in a variety of leadership roles. Partly because we need people who have experienced these challenges in different ways, who have seen how the world works from different perspectives. One of the things we forget is that we have largely created an education ghetto from the way we've approached teacher and leadership preparation and careers in this country. When you teach in business schools, and you teach people, like when I taught at Rice, and you get people to be education leaders, they're sitting side by side with people who are learning nonprofit management and sleazy folks who wanted to work at Enron. And they're learning how these things work in different environments. When we teach at schools of education, we only teach career educators, and they mostly get taught by retired career administrators, and you wind up with a relatively narrow thought bubble. But this is partly where I get concerned that when I hear diversity used in a conversation like this, and it seems to have been reduced to racial diversity. And it seems to me that if we're going to say, we just mean race diversity, we just mean pigmentation. Well, let's be clear about that. If we're using the term diversity, let's be honest, that diversity actually encompasses people with different values, different dispositions, different experiences. And when I see the graphics on this, when organizations report on their diversity, all of these other kinds of things seem to have fallen by the wayside somewhere over time. And so we wind up with what feels to me like an incredibly narrow and undiverse notion of diversity. And I don't think we're the better for it. The other point, which I think is really important, is when you look at what you learn, whether it's in schools of education when you're doing an EDD, or whether you are getting professional development in school systems as an admin, or whether you're working with reform groups, the vast majority of the training folks get outside of working on assessment and instructional rounds and unpacking data tends to be a little bit of high-level compliance stuff around contracts and school finance systems. We do very little to teach leaders the skill sets that equip them to think differently about technology, about how to leverage accountability, about how do you actually manage implementation strategies for new procurement systems. And then we get puzzled and frustrated when leaders don't do these things well, or when they don't do them with any imagination, and we say we need better leaders. In most lines of work, I think when you don't prepare people for concrete, specific, hard-to-handle challenges, even really good people are not going to do well at them. And so I think, again, instead of just searching for great leaders, partly it's how do we equip leaders to do these actions in ways that are great for kids.
Great.
Just a couple of points. So I agree with the both and, but I do disagree with your notions of diversity. And I think we actually have to explicitly name that we have a shortage of Black and Latino leaders, and I have no problem talking about that fact, because we are underrepresented in this work. We are not at the table. And therefore, how is a leader to be made if we aren't invited to the table from the beginning? So I don't think I think it's wrong to dilute diversity. Of course we want people with different backgrounds, different experiences. But when we're really talking about achievement gaps and who's affected by that, these are Black and brown children. And so if we do not have the leaders that represent the children that so desperately need our leadership, we have a problem.
Derrell?
By the way, I also want to just ask Mike, you got like future chiefs, you got like current chiefs. You gotta have like a recovering chiefs, which is like, it's like a perpetual happy hour.
That's why Chris is back there. He's first in line for the ball. Smart guy.
I know. I just want to say something on this because I'm not of two minds about the fact that we need more diversity of leadership. And I certainly think that has a broader definition than most people do. But when the teaching force is 80% white, that says something. You know, and I always get really frustrated when somebody is trying to tell me like, oh, you don't know anything about Black kids. It's like, well, I'm the only person in this conversation been Black all my life, so. But I was writing this piece about this. Like the challenge, I think, and this is sort of like a technical one, is actually not about diversity per se. It's about the politics of not being diverse, right? So in a universe in a universe where there's a whole bunch of white people sitting in a room, right? The political ability to do things is lessened, right? So if you look at, you know, the sort of universe of charter school leaders, right, which are more diverse than district school leaders, but still not as diverse as the kids they serve. And then you look at all the discussions around like, well, charter schools don't have enough, you know, leaders of color. Like the fact is that we have to take it in the face from the NAACP on this because of that, right? So whether or not you come to the question of diversity of leadership purely as like the teachers understand the kids and are like them and have similar experiences, which is deeply valuable and essentially engineered out of the system, or because like in the absence of that, we can't build the political support we need to continue to make like what we want to do possible. Like either way, both of those questions have the same answer, which is diversity. So.
All right, good, very, very important stuff. Let's get into some questions now at the state and local level. I want to ask you about this moment in time that we find ourselves in. We think about, let's start with states, okay? We can think of some great state chiefs that have been in these positions over the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, and they've been involved in these big national education reforms, No Child Left Behind, and standards-based reform, and charter schools, and Race to the Top, and now here we are, and you know, there's a sense, I would say, that there's a little question about where are we going. You know, ESSA gives a lot of power back to the states. There's been some complaints from some folks in DC that states haven't taken that ball and run with it as much as some of us would like. But what is on the to-do list for a state leader right now? And what does that imply about the kind of state leader we need for this next phase of reform?
Well, I'll start. You know, in our specific situation, and I'll broaden it out a minute, in Tennessee, our specific work is to dig deeper on the foundation that we've now set. And that foundation was on setting high expectations. 2007, we had 2 Fs in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Fast forward to 2018, we can say 10 years later that we now have high standards and we're telling our kids the truth. Finally, this year, we have closed the gap around what we were telling. 2007, we said 90% of our kids in Tennessee, 90% were proficient in math and reading, and we felt really good about ourselves. They would take NAEP, 24% were proficient. They would take the ACT, atrocious. So what we knew was that we weren't telling people the truth. So we have spent 10 years, 4 standard changes, multiple assessment changes, different accountability models, different teacher evaluation models, to finally get to a point where we can say that was worth it and we're at a strong foundation. Standards, assessment, and new accountability. Changes that we've made, as we have said, every day. We're going to continuously improve. We're going to grow, and based on what we know, we're going to try to get better. So I would say our next path is to go deeper, but you cannot get rid of what you gained. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people try to make this either or. Well, see, all that work didn't work. Right? You haven't reached where you wanted to reach yet. Well, the reality is this is a long game. And we actually are better than where we were 10 years ago. We have hundreds of data points we can point to and say we are better, but not everywhere are we better. right? In some places, we may have gone backwards during that time,
Yeah.
but there are places we know we've got to dig deeper. to move forward.
So tell me, what does digging deeper mean?
Great
And
question.
is it, I mean, is there another policy play? I mean, a lot of this in the last 10, 15 years was state chiefs pushing a policy agenda, or at least governors maybe pushing a policy agenda, getting legislators to vote in a certain way. It sounds like you're talking about something very different now.
Yeah, I give the equation here of the analogy of climbing a mountain. I feel like we've done a lot of work to get to sort of that first base camp, right? And now we're on a climb. And to get there, what we're doing in classroom instruction really matters. How do we ensure that what's happening in the classroom with effective teachers, with individual student needs, actually gets to what we all envisioned when we were changing standards, changing assessment, and making this really strong accountability model. And the reality is that we're not there. To do what we have to do every day with every single student in the classroom is the next stage of work. And it's also to make sure kids are engaged in what they want to do. What do these students want to do, and do they talk about it and engage in it earlier? Which is why I think high school has to be thought different. We have to think differently around what we're doing in high school to make sure that we actually are engaging kids. I get frustrated when high school after high school after high school and kids are disengaged. But we're trying to regroup on what does high school look like, particularly at the 10th, 11th, and 12th grade year, that really gets this bridge to post-secondary or to career a reality for our students. That's where I think our next stage of work will be, as well as classroom instruction and that relationship between the teacher, the community supports, and that student and those individual student needs. We know if we don't change our pathway with English language learners, our students of color, if we don't dig deeper with them, we will never meet our goals. And that has to be part of the conversations that we're having in the next stage.
Okay. Amanda?
So I humbly sit on the State Board of Education in Massachusetts. And we have a new commissioner. So I'm not going to speak for him, but I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the issues that we as a board need to address and work with him on addressing at the state level. So as some of you may know, Massachusetts has been an extremely polarized state. A couple of years ago, there was a ballot initiative to lift the cap on charter school expansion. That failed, and it failed pretty miserably. The job of the commissioner in Massachusetts is to start to change that dynamic. We have to work through the divide, and that can sound Pollyanna, but it really is essential, because we may be #1 in the nation right now in terms of student achievement and outcomes, but we are only #1 for some. And so the job of the commissioner is to break through that divide, to start really focusing on closing those achievement gaps, and that is where our energy must go as a board, and in support of our commissioner in doing that.
So I just want to keep pushing though, Amanda and Candice, because I mean, it all sounds great, but I don't know, what do you actually do at the state level? I mean, all of that sounds like stuff that is happening in local schools or at local districts. I don't know a law you can pass or a regulation you can pass to make those things happen, and that's okay. I mean, maybe we just acknowledge that we've done the policy work, we got to play defense on some of it, and now the work is at the local level. But then what's the state? What can the state do? What can a state board member do? What can a commissioner do to support this stuff?
Yeah, let me do a quick response and then I'll turn it over. I mean, it absolutely is still a combination of influence, accountability, and potential policy changes, right? You may not have the, like we had over 5 or 6 years, we had like every policy change, and we put in lots and lots of new ones, and we're still actually implementing policies that were put in 5, 6, 7 years ago, and now we're starting to see some momentum around those policies as they get implemented. So it's not necessarily the same policies, but there are policies right now on our high school and bridge to post-secondary that are going to be changed. How we think about incentivizing our students to think about career much earlier, those are policy changes. How we have our students actually focused on the work itself in the classroom. There's some interesting ways you can influence that through influencing teachers with your training, how you support curriculum choices that they're making, materials that teachers need, and how you connect the dots to your assessment. So there's big work, maybe slightly different work than what we were doing. The problem is you don't want to cease and desist what you have been doing. That has to continue, and then you dig deeper on things that have already changed.
So I'd like to thank all the smart, dedicated, capable people who could set goals in the room so that I could write about you doing it. So I just wanted to that. But I say that only also to say that like this is also the advocate's dilemma right now, and this is partly the challenge of like the post Duncan Obama era. My boss, he always says, at least then we had sort of like a playbook. There was a list that people were moving down, and like state chiefs were kind of moving down it, and advocacy groups are kind of moving down it, and there was like a sense of that you could articulate it, even though there was obviously tension in it, among advocates, even like choice-based different things and different people and that kind of stuff, and that's gone now. And right now, I would just say that I feel like we're struggling both with a sort of constipation of the imagination to like lay out a vision that is like tactile enough that you can talk about it in terms of like real policy right now. And it's really hard to do that right now. Like the politics of the moment don't make it easy to do. And certainly like the fact that we seem to have come undone over a lot of the things we did during the Duncan Obama era don't help it either. The other thing too is just that it's like, what I hear from everybody is like workforce development, and it's like, okay, great. So like, how do you do that? Right? And I think like most sort of cyclical things, like something else will emerge that is like easier to hold on to. But like this, at least like, I'm kind of like the old head doing this now. Like there hasn't been a moment where it felt like there was less direction than now. And the one other thing I would just say about that is like, this to me is also like a real humble moment, because like I'm convinced that what we need to do is sort of like design like playing fields where people can play, not like all the rules about the sport, which is like a very different sort of orientation. We got to do that in a way that keeps the public happy, as Mike would say, so that there are some assurances, which I think is a benign and useful word, to talk to people about how the money's being spent, like to deal with questions of equity and success for underrepresented kids, about which I care very much. But it is a looser vision on the future, and because it's looser, it's that much harder to articulate.
No, very well said. But what about at the local level? All right, so a lot again, but we've talked about curriculum reform and teaching and learning at the local level. What else? Is there a playbook for district leaders, for these future chiefs that are going to lead urban districts? Is over the years we talked about portfolio, we talked about centralizing instructional stuff, charter, this, that. Rick, what do you see? You've written about this forever. And the same issue right now in the urban world. That we've got new superintendents in some of the biggest cities in the country. Is there a common approach they're taking, or is it also kind of all over the map?
So I think one thing is that we have this thing where reporters call or advocates call, and they want to know what are the 4 districts they should look at, or who are the 5 leaders they really ought to be talking to. And for some godforsaken reason, we actually answer that question, even though hardly anybody actually knows what they're talking about. You've been old friends with this superintendent. You spent 2 days getting a dog and pony tour of that district. You read an article about that. It's insane. Would you tell your parents to buy a stock based on that? I hope not. And here we're talking about our professional responsibilities. So I think part of the problem is that we have this habit of deciding that there is a district and that's the playbook, or these superintendents who we like, who won an award. We don't know. I don't know. I have no idea. I have a lot of time to study this stuff and look at people. I have no earthly idea. What I do know is that it appears that there are different schools and different systems that get better for kids at tackling the work in different ways, using different strategies. And I think partly, a lot of it, is how effectively they've executed the strategy they're doing, how thoughtful they've been about getting aligned with the community, about bringing in people who know how to execute, who pay attention and don't go off chasing a shiny new, not a shiny new distraction every 18 months. And some of it is because some strategies work well given the geography of a district, given the demographics of the student population, given the skills of the teacher workforce. But it's a lot of fun to go around trying to distill a 5-point kind of playbook, because we can get $300,000 from a foundation to do it, and then we get to publish it, and we get to go around the country talking about it. And then other people are stuck actually trying to do it, and when they don't get the results, we get to write about how they fumbled the implementation. So, I mean, I think for me, part of this is look, you know, what characterizes really good organizations generally, when you read the research on this stuff, in the nonprofit sector, in the for-profit sector, in government, what usually characterizes them is this ruthless fidelity to execution. They get people who know what their job is, they show up every day, they do their job well, they coach new hires on how to do their job well, they don't tolerate people who consistently do their job poorly. And it turns out when you do that, there's lots of leadership styles that can work. There's lots of strategies that can work. But this has been a really hard lesson for us to learn, partly because we're trying to figure out how do we change all these stubborn districts that may well be unmanageable, because we're trying to work with school boards, which aren't necessarily set up to enable and support this kind of leadership, because we're working around regulatory norms and budgetary restrictions and collectively bargaining provisions, vendor agreements, and all kinds of stuff that makes it hard to execute this. So we keep looking for some way to do it that's going to make it easier and more manageable. And I think, you know, the governor was talking about being blunt and forthright and honest. And for me, part of that is understanding how much of what we talk about as bold reform and as bold leadership seems to be a concerted effort to avoid facing up to the stuff that really frustrates us.
Okay. Let's get you into this conversation if we can. We've got about 10 more minutes left, so tell us if you've got a question for the panel. Tell us your name and where you're from. Try to make it a question, and let's do everything we can to not answer or have a question from the one journalist in the room. No, just kidding. Thank you for being here, Matt. Oh, two. Oh, good. Hello. Nice to see you. Here, let's give somebody else a chance first, and then we'll get to you, Matt. Because you know, Rick already talked about how journalists ask these questions that we should just stop answering. And Rick, this is why I get more quotes in the press. It's because I answer the questions. Secret.
Because your friend told the reporter to call you.
Yes, exactly. Come on, they ask, you answer. Okay, who's got a question out there? Okay, yes, sir. Speaking of a former recovering chief, and do we need a mic? Do we have a mic? Here, let's run a mic over to him. You got all right.
I can use my 8th grade teacher.
Well, I know, but people are watching online. It's the new. It's 2018. You think this is not the whole audience? Come on.
So hi everybody. I'm Steve Vaughn from CCSSO, former chief in Maine. So I will be at the bar with the rest of the former chiefs. Good question, sort of building on what you said, Rick, around like how do we build ecosystems around these leaders to support them? So a group of us from CCSO were in Alaska last week because Michael Johnson, chief out there, was working on a strategic plan that his governor's leading. He needed us to come out. We spent 2 days with his team. And it was one of these where they're like, okay, send us down the team that's working on this, and then send us the team that's working on this, and we'll go right down through the plan. Well, guess what? We have the same people all day long because that department is tiny, and it's in Juneau, and there's just not a lot of infrastructure around to support that team. And Alaska might be an extreme case, but I've been to almost every state capital city in the country. There's not these robust sets of infrastructure around these leaders where they're tied to higher ed, they're tied to the business community that knows how do we build ecosystems around these leaders? So when we do have these future leaders and put them into these positions, there is a network around them that they can drop into that can give them the support they might need. Welcome to Fox.
Well, I'll use, again, a Tennessee-specific example because that's where we, I think, have excelled in terms of a reform organization. So many of you in here know SCORE, our Statewide Collaborative on Reform in Education, which essentially is made up of a board of all the most influential industry, philanthropic leaders in our state. And so these are people who care about education, but they're also the people who have influence in lots and lots of other ways. And that particular organization has, one, helped us stay focused, and it has this reform orientation that's very practical, goal-oriented, sustainable across different administrations, and it has a bent toward leadership, right? Helping people be leaders. So we are, quite frankly, supported by them to help new leaders that we have in our department, to help folks who are on the ground in leadership roles. They now have a network of district leaders who are essentially some of the leaders that we believe are some of our best leaders in the state. And so that particular network now works together on problems of practice and projects and tries to push the conversation. And then they invite other district leaders into that network. And we're really trying to grow our district leaders through that. But you need something that is an organization like that gives a lot of continuity and sustainability, goal orientation, and then has leadership at the center of it.
And it's interesting that SCORE is one of these educational reform advocacy groups that we now have seen all over the country, but it's one of the few focused on leadership. I mean, most of them are focused still on policy advocacy. And that's an interesting thing, that this might be a kind of role that others could play. Okay, Matt, we'll go ahead and we'll let's hear from the reporter. It's okay, right over in the front, Matt Barnum. From Chalkbeat. What's on your mind?
Thanks. I wanted to ask about a current event, the teacher strikes and teacher uprisings across the country. And I'm interested in sort of the general thoughts on the substantive case for raising teacher pay. And I've noted that during the panel, we haven't seen much discussion about teachers and the best way to recruit and retain effective teachers. I also am interested in the context, in the context of leadership. And we might think about these teacher uprisings and strikes as a form of grassroots cage-busted leadership. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
Interesting how some of the leaders have also responded, in many cases, marched with the teachers. Rick, yeah.
Sure. Let's take West Virginia, right? West Virginia, per pupil spending is up after inflation 40% between 94 and 2015, 92 and 2015. Real teacher pay after inflation is down 2%. This is a product of leadership decisions. They have added non-instructional staff at West Virginia. It's up 30%, even the student enrollment is down. This is inertia taking place at the state leadership level and district policy. If they had simply raised teacher pay at the same rate per pupil expenditures had gone up in West Virginia since the mid-90s, average teacher pay would be $63,000 a day. So partly, this is a consequence of ineffectual, lethargic leadership on the most important levers, on human capital, on staffing decisions, on how these things get done. The second part of it, let's bring Kentucky in, is there is a huge bite taken out of teacher compensation for benefits. Now, partly, I think teachers in West Virginia and Oklahoma ought to make more than $43,000, $44,000, $45,000 a year? I do. It's easy for me to say I don't have to pay the taxes. But I want to pay them more money when I'm confident that those dollars are actually showing up in rewarding the teachers who are working in my kids' schools and in other kids' schools. Right now, I'm not confident of that when you look at the design of some of these pension systems. Part of the failure of leadership, and part of why I was so hard on things like Race to the Top, is there was a window where a number of states tackled, for instance, municipal benefit structures over time. For instance, Kentucky state employees were moved off of the retirement plan the teachers are on onto a 9% state contribution, where the employees are now enrolled in Social Security, which teachers are not, which saves the state a non-trivial amount, about 5 to 10% of salary, and more of compensation is showing up in take-home pay. Now, you can say that's a good idea, and we should pay teachers more, which is fine, but what state leadership should be about is a grand bargain, where we find ways to pay teachers better, we overhaul outdated outdated benefit systems, and we make sure that we're finding ways to steer more of those dollars to teachers who are doing more good work for kids. So it seems to me that that is a conversation that we should have been having over the last decade, that reformers failed to have. By failing to have it, reformers pretty much poisoned the brand of what they were talking about. So now we're seeing teachers kind of express frustration and seek money. And it seems to me that we have created a much more difficult environment for leaders to step up. But leaders still ought to step up and try to find ways to make sure that this isn't just about incremental increases in pay, but it's also about setting schools up to spend dollars on ways they're going to do things for kids going forward.
All right, let's have time for one last question. Anybody out there? You've already picked one. Okay, that's fine. Go ahead over there. Sorry about that. We'll do it at the bar. With, by the way, former Chief David Steiner, who is such a recovering chief, he came in just in time for the drinks. That was so well done. Nice. Yes.
Hi, Stephanie with Garnett, Institute for Student Achievement, and we're an urban high school reform unit. My question is, Derrell talked about unleadable districts and unleadable schools. Josh, our instructional coach, talked about what it feels like not to have mentors. I really want to know, what are we doing to create true opportunities for leaders of color? We work with schools all over the country, and there are only certain jobs that leaders of color can get. And they are unleadable, they are impossible, they are under-resourced. And we really need to have a frank conversation about what are the conditions that we are working on in Chiefs for Change and other organizations, so that the selection process does not isolate leaders of color in roles that are impossible. All kids need leaders of color, even white school districts. So I really would like to know, what are you doing to break down systemic barriers for leaders of color to have opportunities in the places we're talking about, but opportunities in general when we've got a lot of favoritism and systems that are against us?
Great question. Who wants it?
I'll go quick and then great question. So I can't tell you how many times I've had to tell people, it's like, dude, if you look for somebody to be the outreach manager, it's not me. Because like, I was a policy wonk. I write. That is my thing, you know. I only highlight that as an example of the fact that, like, most of the time, if you're a person of color and you work in an organization like mine, or you work at you get to be the dean of discipline, right? Because you must be good with the students. You get to be you get to organize the pastors because you must. I can't tell you the last time I went to church. So,
I don't mean to talk to you about that.
That's right. So it is important to just like I would just say, like, check your own sort of assumption when you go to place somebody, because this kind of stuff is not always the right fit. And then you have like somebody who would have been a great director of policy for you who's failing because like they don't get along well with African American moms who live in Central Brooklyn. So like let's talk about that, right? The second thing I would just say this, I had like a little plan about this. So you actually have to have a structure if you want somebody to sort of matriculate into the highest levels of these organizations and systems, and you have to be, I hate to use this word, you have to be intentional about it, right? So the first one is that you have to have like multiple lenses on leading, to my point about like different kinds of competencies that can be rounded out to make people more effective. So that's the first one. The second one is that it's like, like in our thing, at least in my experience, a person needs to be heard, right? So you have to have a platform for your ideas so that people see how you think about the world in a way that kind of transcends what might happen if you're in like a little box. Because like, even though a lot of people in this room, there are not a lot of us. So that's kind of the second thing. And the third thing I would just say is that you have to have a rabbi. And by that, I don't mean a rabbi. I mean a person who looks out for you, right? So it's not always a mentor. Sometimes it's a person who like navigates politics and a whole bunch of other stuff for you. Like if you can find, and you know, the last thing is really like money. So like over time, I can't tell you how much people have spent so that I can be here with you right now and say something that sounds cogent. I can tell you it wasn't inexpensive. Right? Including like fancy colleges and a whole bunch of other stuff over a very long period of time. And I think one thing people do is think, oh, I'm making an amazing leader of color on the cheap, right? And it's like everybody who goes through an MBA program pays the same amount of money. Because it costs the same amount of money to make an awesome black MBA as it does to make an awesome white MBA. So I just think we're going to be like more serious about the fact that like when you want to invest in people, it's not cheap to invest in, and because somebody's black or brown or whatever, the price doesn't go down.
If anything, it should be more because of the assets that we bring.
Come to my next job negotiation.
So you said that African Americans get pegged to be the discipline leader, and Latinos get pegged to be the interpreter of the entire school. So I don't think I'm going to add a whole lot more to what you said because that's all right. But when I think about the entire pipeline, and I'm thinking specifically about Latino leaders, It starts with the intentional recruitment of Latino teachers. Right now, the barriers are so substantial for Latinos to even go into teaching. Why would if I'm a Latino who has made it and I have a college degree, teaching is not the first thing I'm going to consider. Plus, my mother would never let me. She's going to say, go be a doctor, go be a lawyer. So what are the incentives for recruiting and getting more Latinos into the pipeline and other low-income individuals who want to go into the profession? Financial barriers are always there for us. So when we think about policy, what can be done at the policy level to remove some barriers financially so that when Boston Public Schools wants to recruit more Latino teachers, they can go to the higher ed institutions and say, we demand that you bring in more Latinos into your programs, but you've got to create the conditions for them to get there.
Wow, what a fantastic panel. Please join me in thanking them. Nobody held back. I love it. And now let me turn it over to Mike McGee one more time. And then it's the race to the top.
Thank you, Mike. Well, once again, thank you everyone for joining us today. So appreciative that you all came and hung in there for 2 hours. I hope you all heard today a real call to action to do what you can do to help create that more robust, more diverse pipeline of future chiefs and chiefs in American public schools. It's so critically important, and and we're going to need all the help we can get to make that happen. The last thing I wanted to say is this day has very much been about the leaders who have joined our third cohort of future chiefs. And I'd just love it if they could all just stand for a moment to be recognized, because they're about to be very You've heard a lot of talk about a bar downstairs. So feel free to head that way, and thank you again very much.